Hey, 4 weeks ago, I had a mushroom tea ceremony with my girlfriend Megan, and I'd like to share that story and some of the insights that I gained from it. So to start, Megan had actually never taken mushrooms before, and so as a means of making it more easily digestible in a physical sense, not necessarily a spiritual sense, we decided to make a tea because it usually the effects of the medicine onset more quickly, and it's just less stressful on your stomach. So Megan and I, we started by listening to Electric Light Orchestra, and then we drank the tea around noon, and it was a beautiful sunny Saturday. The sunshine was beaming into my living room, and then we put on one of the Scumfrog sets. For any of you who are big music fans, definitely recommend checking him out. Um, and Yeah, so with my mushroom ceremony, and whenever I use any hallucinogen or substance, or really go into any endeavor in my life, I like to set an intention, something that I want to accomplish through the experience. And so my intention with this mushroom tea ceremony was twofold. And first off, it was to let go of any limiting behaviors so that I can step into my fullest potential. And by that I mean I want to let go of any old programming, any doubts, any insecurities about my life's path and about what I'm doing, so that I can be the best version of myself that I can be, so that I can better assist and be of service to as many people as possible within my power. And my second intention was to have a unifying experience with Megan, and just to deepen our bond even further. So we had this tea. We both sort of meditated on our intentions, and we drank it, and it tastes really good. And after, typically if you eat mushrooms, the onset of the effects is usually like 30 minutes, sometimes up to an hour before you start feeling anything. But with the tea, prior to us even having finished our cup, so about 10 minutes after taking our first sip, a tapestry in my living room, it started moving and waving, and then within about 2 minutes I noticed that it wasn't just the tapestry, but it was everything. It was my entire environment, my body, everything surrounding me was in this wave light, was waving and moving and breathing. Something that often occurs during mushroom experiences is the recognition that all things are alive, and that everything's in a state of flux. And if you look at this on a physics level and you look into a microscope, you go far enough, you realize that molecules are mostly, and atoms are mostly empty space. So it starts to make a little bit of sense how all these things behave almost more like a liquid or in a flow state compared to the solid perception that we often experience on a day-to-day basis. So I'm seeing that everything is alive, and I end up actually just curling up into the fetal position because I get a bit cold, and it wasn't uncomfortable by any means, but I just curled up into the fetal position, lying on the hardwood floor, and going into like a really deep, meditative and chilled out, relaxing space. And so the sun, as I mentioned, the sun was beaming in through the living room onto my face, and as I'm lying there with eyes closed, I'm suddenly in essentially an Alex Grey painting. For anyone who has seen those, super psychedelic and very beautiful and explorative. I recommend just do a quick Google search if you haven't seen any of his paintings. But as opposed to an Alex Grey painting, which is two-dimensional in that it's a painting, my experience of being inside of this painting. It was multi-dimensional, so it was like going in infinite direction, and I could navigate through this realm. And it was a lot of blues and orange and very fractal in nature, repetition of sequences and patterns and shapes, and on to infinity. It never ended. And then I encountered this large, what if I were to personify this entity, it would have been a large, overweight woman who had a very goddess energy. And in my mind, I recognized her to be Shakti, which is a goddess energy. And she was reaching towards me and sort of welcoming her into her embrace. And comforting me, and I'm feeling the sunshine pouring onto me, and I'm feeling this loving goddess's embrace, and it's a very beautiful and uplifting and comforting experience. And then so I roll over onto my right side, which was in the shadow, so the sun wasn't reaching this part of my living room. Roll over onto my right side, and I'm in the shadows, and I start seeing all of these dark entities. and they were very fractal in nature, and they were expanding out infinitely in different directions, and a lot of them had these green and red eyes that resembled goblins from films and cartoons, and they weren't particularly inviting or enjoyable to look at, and I recognized them as sort of dark entities. And they were reaching for me and seemingly trying to, or wanting to come into my space, but I simply looked at them, I observed them, I said, I'm not really interested in spending time with you guys right now. And their response was sort of a telepathic, okay, that's fine, like, we're not going to invade your personal space. And some people will talk about universal law in that nothing will come into your space unless you allow it. So long as you ask something not to invade your space, it won't. And it brings up really interesting notions about like light and dark, which I'll get into a bit later. But anyway, back to this particular mushroom tea experience, and I'm lying on the floor, and then so I start seeing like these dark beings are infinite and fractal in nature, and then I roll back over into the sun, and I recognize that there's all these beings, all of these conscious entities that exist in the space that we typically perceive nothing to be happening. So right here in front of me, like right there, it's just a fractal dimensions of infinite conscious entities that we're typically unaware of. And it's largely understood if you look at the brain under the influence of mushrooms, the prefrontal cortex is down-regulated. So essentially the prefrontal cortex is our filtration system. So that aspect of our brain is down-regulated, which means that we are technically experiencing more of what's going on around us. And so we are seeing things that do exist. They're not, the notion of a hallucination doesn't mean you're seeing something that's not there. It just simply means you're seeing something that you don't typically perceive. And What's cool about that is, the reason we have a prefrontal cortex is to focus our cognition and focus our energy, because if we were exposed to all that was going around us all of the time, we would likely just exist in a state of awe and wonder and probably wither away until we died, essentially, because we would just recognize the beauty of all things, and we wouldn't necessarily see the need for progress or accomplishment or even the need to eat, because we would just be in this state of bliss. So our prefrontal cortex does certainly have function in that it allows us to survive and for the propagation of our species. But anyway, so I'm noticing that all of these different entities, they're infinite, and my attention is being diverted amongst infinite stimuli. And so in my mind, I'm asking myself, okay, what should I focus on, given that my intention is to let go of any limiting beliefs so that I can step into my fullest potential. And I realized that as I was navigating this realm, the response I was receiving, the understanding I was learning was that, you don't really need to decide. Just go with the flow and go with how you feel, and whatever interests you, just, you can navigate towards it, and you don't have to select one particular entity and just focus on it alone. So that brought a certain sense of peace, and is largely how I try to live my life in a very flow state. And that isn't to say that I don't focus my attention on particular goals, but just being open to a lot of things. And so then it was really interesting because Megan was having her first mushroom experience beside me, and I was going through the dichotomy of, okay, like, how much do I focus on my first intention and how much do I focus on my second intention, and just unifying those two and allowing her to have her experience without imposing any of my perceptions on it, seeing as it is her first time. So it's a very explorative situation. And so Megan was looking around, she was moving around and experiencing like things moving and shapes changing and perceptions she had never encountered before. So she was in a total like state of wonder and so almost borderline disbelief. And so she was asking me, she's like, how are you so still? Because I was just lying on the floor. And I just sort of smiled at her, and because she was moving around, it was all brand new to her. And so after a while, I recognized that, okay, I want to have a unifying experience with Megan, and I want to engage in that second intention which isn't, when I say second, it's not necessarily hierarchical, just for the purpose of this conversation. And so she was actually going through a particular time where she was struggling with her necklace and whether or not she wanted to be wearing it. And there's a very interesting phenomenon that I've encountered while under the influence of mushrooms, and that is with respect to making decisions, because I often wonder, okay, when is a decision made? And an example I'll use is, let's say you go, the room's a bit dark and you're thinking about turning on the light switch, but you don't have a dimmer, so you're not sure if you want that stark contrast of going through the subtle darkness to like extreme brightness. And so you wonder about this decision and whether what you want to do with it. And then the idea is that, okay, you decide you're going to turn on the light, but then you actually get up and then you go and turn on the light. But then once you turn on the light, you still have the opportunity to turn off that light. So is a decision ever fully made? Is a conclusion ever arrived at? Or are things just constantly in this state of flux? And I could tell that Megan was going through this experience with her necklace of whether or not she wanted to wear it. And then whenever she would think of taking it off, the question would pop into her head of, okay, like, why do I want to take it off? And then am I just going to put it on again later? And it can sort of become this cyclical thought pattern. And it's not necessarily that pleasurable or enjoyable, but it can be. And it's a learning lesson about how your brain operates in a more macrocosmic sense, and not just isolated to that individual experience. And so having been there before, I helped her undo the necklace. It was very, very simple for me in that moment, although it's not always. And so then we were sitting there speaking with one another, and we were talking with one another about what we mean to each other, and seeing this union between the two of us, of the feminine and of the masculine, and of the divine feminine and of the divine masculine. And then questions such as, which one of us are really the feminine or the masculine? And I mean, you could be listening to me thinking, okay, obviously, dude, you're the guy, she's the girl. But you might also consider, okay, since I'm the one experiencing the feminine, experiencing the divine feminine, does that make me feminine? And vice versa, she's experiencing the masculine, the divine masculine through me, so she's the one experiencing that. And then it's sort of more of a co-creation than an individual creation with respect to that. So we were talking about what we meant to each other, and we were exploring our thoughts in a very cosmic and deep sense. So we were exploring thoughts that we didn't necessarily have conclusions for, and ones that we perhaps hadn't thought of before. And it was very interesting because I'll use a visual representation, and it was like the the divine masculine and the divine feminine coming together, unifying, and then like sort of twisting and enveloping, and then this union where the duality or the separation becomes lost in favor of the union and, let's say, the singularity. And then as we were sitting there, I had this flashback to a dream I had had the night prior. And it was a dream that when I woke up, I didn't remember, I hadn't thought of. But then in this moment, I very vividly remembered having the dream. And so I said to Megan, I'm like, holy shit, like I'm remembering this dream. Last night, I was dreaming that you and I were in a farm field near a barn, and we were having a psychedelic experience together. And then we walked into my living room, and as I'm saying this to Megan during the mushroom ceremony, my hands start going like this, and then I'm like, whoa. And then we were in my living room having a psychedelic experience, and I'm like, holy shit, we're in the dream right now. And then my hands went as though I was sort of channeling this, and I wasn't really intentionally doing this with my hands, but all of time and space collapsed into one moment, like, and the dream dimension, physical reality, it all became one. We were inside of this dream, and we were reliving it, and I was observing it while simultaneously creating it with her. And it was a pretty astounding experience, because I've never, prior to this time, entered the dream world from the three-dimensional world. And sometimes I think there is some crossover with deja vu, and that might be what's happening, but never has it felt so profound and so obvious, and never have my hands done this and all this crazy stuff. So yeah, I was recognizing like the infinite nature of all things, and but simultaneously this unification of all things, which I understand sounds paradoxical when we use our words, but as my friend Vanessa has often said, words are quite limiting, and she's not the only one saying that either. I think we're all a bit aware of that, and so yeah, having the dream world and the physical world merge was obviously quite profound. And then this recognition that because I was observing the dream while simultaneously creating it, it's this nature of experience and creation. And in all moments, we are simultaneously creating and experiencing. It's sort of like this loop, like because let's say you write a book, for example. I mean, as you're writing it, you're also the first person reading it. So you're writing and reading, and you're telling the story while experiencing the storytelling, as is happening in this video that I'm creating right now. And so it's this really profound experience, and again, the recognition that things aren't really separate. It's all this like one swirling entity. So then Megan and I were further exploring our thoughts now inside of this dream. And we were listening to music, and as I mentioned, we were playing a set by the Scumfrog, and then on my iPod and on this playlist, it transitioned to a set by one of my good friends. His DJ name's Misul, real name Mohammed, and just beautiful music. And as Megan and I are speaking, we are noticing that the music is the manifestation, or perhaps simply the expression, of the thoughts that we're having. And we're looking at each other because we are telepathically synchronized with the music, and all three of us, Megan, me, and the music, are creating our thoughts together, and in this space that sort of exists beyond all of our physical bodies. And as Megan and I are exploring our thoughts as to what she and I mean to one another, the music starts, the lyrics come out, "You and I are the same and always will be." And both of us started crying in this moment, because I understand, to anyone listening to me speak right now, you could chalk it up to coincidence or whatever you want, but we were quite aware in this scenario that we were co-creating the music, and that it was not independent of our thoughts, but that it was unified with them. And this isn't the first time that I've experienced the telepathic creation of music and the instant manifestation of hearing it. I once did this in a car ride with my friends Elon and Tim, who were witness to it, but that's a story for another time. But yeah, the experience of telepathically co-creating music is one that I think is what will happen in the future with music. I'll get back to that. But anyway, my friend Ryan and I were talking about this experience after, because I was talking with him about how it might seem as though the song we were listening to was recorded 3 years prior, and then had to be the producer who made it had to play it somewhere, and then let's say some DJ in Nicaragua played it, and Muhammad was there listening, and he heard it, and then he Shazammed it on his phone, identified the song, and then he downloaded it and bought it later, and then he decided to play it, and then put it into a set that he recorded, and then emailed it to me, and then I downloaded that set, put it onto my iPod, and then on the day that we were having the mushroom ceremony, plugged the iPod into my auxiliary cord that then broadcasted the sound through the cord and out the speakers, and filling the environment that we were in, and then flooding our consciousness. So that is the logical, linear, sequential form in which we typically perceive that music arrives to us. And I mean, that in and of itself is a pretty profound journey when you think of all the steps that are required for the inception of a song, the idea for it to then be manifested into an actual song by a producer, and then arrive at any given listener's ears. But so Ryan and I were talking about this, and I have this notion that many of you have probably heard me talk about, that time is not necessarily linear the way we typically perceive it, but that time operates much more similar to space, in that the same way that New York and London are occurring simultaneously, so too are the years 2016 and 2000 AD. And the way that we can travel from New York to London via plane is similar to the way that we can travel from 2016 to the year 2 million via our consciousness. So So I'm speaking with Ryan about how Megan and I created this song with our thoughts, and then it played and filled our consciousness. So the telepathic co-creation. And then Ryan was very intrigued by this idea, and he presented another point. He's like, maybe it was produced 3 years ago and then traveled that whole sequence I mentioned earlier, but that the artist who made the song, his inspiration was mine and Megan's situation sitting in that very room. So perhaps 3 years ago, let's say the producer of this song was a German guy, and he's sitting in German and he feels this inspiration, like, oh, I have to create that song. And ask the question to yourself, where does inspiration come from? And perhaps his inspiration for making that song was Megan and I sitting in my living room talking about our love for one another, talking about what we mean for one another, coming from the future and then going back in time to that German guy's apartment and inspiring him. Because for anyone who's created anything, any artist, any song maker or painter or writer or whatever it is that you do, that you create in the world, sometimes inspiration just comes to you and it's like, where does that come from? It's similar to the idea of where does the idea for something brand new come from, like an invention. Like think about the boomerang. Before a boomerang ever existed, before it was something that existed in three-dimensional reality, where does that idea come from? Like, how does somebody arrive at that? You might speculate that the inspiration from it comes from the future, of a boomerang existing in the future, traveling back in time and then inspiring the original inventor to actually follow the steps to create it and manifest it into 3D reality. There was... after Megan and I had this co-creative, telepathic, and musical experience, we both started crying because of the profundity and of the recognition of what was happening. Because, as I mentioned, we were telepathically synchronized, and in these states of consciousness, when recognizing that you are interconnected and one and omnipresent and omniscient and, essentially all things, there was no doubt in our thinking, and we didn't even necessarily have to express it in words because we just knew it. It was there. And of course, I recognize that from the scientific perspective that anecdotal evidence isn't enough, but there also is a deep sense of knowing that all of us have about the way things work. And when we know something, we know it. And I recognize I'm giving an irrefutable argument, but we'll leave it at that for now without diving into how the scientific paradigm operates versus anecdotal evidence. But we knew this. And then a little bit later, it's a pretty interesting experience in that I was feeling cold and I really wanted a pair of socks. And I had a particular pair of socks in mind. You've probably seen them before. They're like the gray wool socks with the red stripe at the top. A lot of people have them. And I just popped into my head, I'm like, I want to wear those socks. So I go up into my room to find those socks. And then when I arrive there, I find a blue wool pair of socks. And then I realized, I'm like, wait, do I even own a pair of those gray socks with the red stripe? And because for a few moments I'm like, oh, I don't want these blue socks, I want these particular gray socks. And then I'm like, well, I might not even own those. And then I sort of speak with myself and I say, just detach from the notion that you need those gray socks. And these blue socks are going to do the job, so just throw them on. And then I went into my closet and I threw on this particular sweater. And I walked down to the living room and I looked at myself, and this might sound a bit silly, but I looked at these blue socks, at the sweater I was wearing, and at the pants I was wearing, and I thought, fuck, I look awesome. This is the best attire I have ever worn. And I just thought I looked so sweet. And yet I didn't really, in a way, choose to wear any of these items. They just sort of flowed and happened, and I arrived at this scenario in which I felt dressed incredibly well. And I think that this is quite anecdotal for the rest of the way our lives operate, because as I'm then standing there in the room, dressed as amazingly as I think one can look, and we all have our own opinions. You might have thought I would look ridiculous, and that's okay, but I'm in there dancing in my living room, the sun's shining, I'm listening to my favorite music in the world, my girlfriend, who I love dearly, is in the other room, and I'm just thinking to myself, I'm dancing, I'm like, this is exactly what I want to be doing. This is my favorite thing possible, and it's all happening. And it's not as though I made the conscious decisions all the way sequentially throughout my life. At the age of 8, I'm like, oh, I'm going to do this so I arrive there. Or at the age of 12, I'm like, I'm going to do this so that I arrive there. Or even a week prior, I'm going to do this so that I'm in my living room dancing at this particular time. But it's very interesting because for anything thing or any scenario to manifest into 3D physical reality, the entire universe and all the history of space and time has to align for any given moment to occur. For you to be listening to me on this video, so many things had to take place, stemming all the way back to the origin of the Big Bang. And I mean, we can even explore the thought that the Big Bang was not the beginning of everything, because, what was before that? But, it goes on infinitely. But, even just for simplicity's sake, let's start 13.5 billion years ago at the start of the Big Bang. The Big Bang had to occur. And then all that matter had to explode in the way exactly which it did. If 4 billion years ago a certain asteroid that was 5 million light years away took a different direction throughout space and then nicked off something and bounced through an asteroid belt and then just even zoomed by our planet, not even hit it, but it would affect the gravitational pull of our planet and then alter it in a different way, and then perhaps the evolution of our species, and whenever DNA arrived to our planet so that all living matter could evolve. All of these things have to happen sequentially, and then the evolution of DNA has to occur on our planet. We have to evolve, Homo sapiens have to become a thing, and then your ancestor, every single one of your ancestors, your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather had to have survived. He couldn't have been killed in a battle out on a field or whatever it was, due to starvation or due to the weather. A tree couldn't fall on him. All these sequences have to occur throughout space and time. And, your parents have to meet each other. And just think about that simplicity of, what if your parents, in the moment that they met at, where they were in a bookstore and they crossed paths with one another, what if they just walked by each other and they didn't say anything? Then you wouldn't exist. And then if you didn't make that decision, and all these sequential patterns and unfoldings have to occur for you to be watching this video right now, looking at me. And it just doesn't seem like, the probability of any given scenario occurring is virtually impossible when you consider things of that nature, which I think is the reason why a lot of people think that everything happens for a reason. And because it does seem as though everything is divinely guided and that we are on this path. Because as I mentioned to you, all of a sudden I haven't made all these conscious decisions to arrive at this place dancing in my living room, but there I am, dancing and having fun. And it was largely this recognition that, just enjoy and celebrate because you did it. You are, I say this all the time, but you are the universe. You don't just live in the universe, you are the universe, and you've created this 3D reality as a way to experience and grow and learn, because the singularity, the Zen state that scientists speculate that we come from in the Big Bang and that everything was one, would have been a Zen state, but we exploded out of that because we wanted to separate and we wanted to experience love, passion, despair, depression, anger, ecstasy, joy, sex, and all of these wonderful things. And there is beauty in all of the dichotomies, even sorrow. There is beauty in it, and you can often recognize that once you're outside of it. And there's even greater power, or at least equal power, if you can recognize the beauty in sorrow while you're even experiencing it. So I've talked for a little while here, but in a nutshell, that was largely what the mushroom experience was about. And yeah, it's certainly, it's funny because at the start of the ceremony, quickly, shortly after drinking, I sort of thought to myself, I've eaten mushrooms a fair number of times, and given that they are a plant teacher or a fungi teacher, I was like, I don't really know if there's anything left to learn from you. I've sort of explored you a lot, and then boom, all of this happened, and sort of the mushroom saying just pay attention, my child. There's a lot to learn. And again, I'm not putting I'm not placing mushrooms on a pedestal as though that there's some the only teacher in the world. You can learn these lessons through simple meditation, or maybe you just think and arrive at these contemplations on your own without the assistance of a substance or a medicine or even meditation. But just these sort of cosmic knowings that we are these divine spiritual beings that can manifest anything. And yeah, just hopefully you enjoyed that story. Love you guys.